It was a typical afternoon when I found myself standing in a situation I never could have imagined. It all started with a simple agreement, a swap. No one expected it to change everything, least of all me. I had always been close to my stepson, but I never thought a simple decision could push us into a world where everything I knew about family, trust, and relationships would be turned upside down. It wasn't just any swap, it was an opportunity, one that seemed innocent enough on the surface. I'd never seen my stepson act this way before, nor did I ever anticipate the sudden shift in his behavior. At first, it seemed like a small change, something that wouldn't lead to anything more than a few awkward moments. But soon, things began to unravel, and the more we tried to fix it, the worse it seemed to get. I'll never forget the day when everything shifted. I was simply trying to keep the peace, to ensure that the decision I made wouldn't affect the family dynamics, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Little did I know, what started as an innocent swap would snowball into something far more complicated. As I look back, it's hard to believe how quickly everything spiraled. What was meant to be a simple act ended up uncovering secrets, feelings, and situations I hadn't prepared for. I had to ask myself, how did we end up here? And how much longer could I keep this under control before it was too late? You may think you know where this is headed, but trust me, you're only scratching the surface. The journey ahead is filled with twists and turns that no one could have predicted. Stay tuned because the real story is just beginning, and I can't promise it will end the way you expect. To understand how we got to this point, you need to know a bit more about the dynamics in our family. My relationship with my stepson had always been good. We weren't best friends, but there was a respect between us. He was a quiet kid, a bit reserved, but I could see the potential in him. My wife, his mom, always said I was a positive influence on him. We'd spent years building trust and making things work, despite the natural challenges that came with blending families. But then, one day, my wife suggested we make this swap. She thought it might be a good idea for me and my stepson to switch places for a few days. No big deal, just a temporary change of scenery. The idea was to give him some space, to see how he'd handle things on his own without the typical family routine. It wasn't the first time we'd discussed something like this, but for some reason, this time felt different. I agreed, mostly because I trusted my wife's judgment. I thought it would give us all a chance to step back and reflect. I was excited to have some time to myself, away from the usual hustle of everyday life. But when I walked into the room that first evening after the swap, I felt an unsettling shift. My stepson's behavior had changed in subtle ways, but enough to make me question everything. He was distant, almost too quiet. I tried to engage with him, ask him how he was doing, but he gave me short, clipped answers. It was like I was talking to a stranger. His usual openness had vanished, replaced by a coldness I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the way he acted, it was the way he looked at me, like there was something unspoken between us that I wasn't catching. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The walls of my own house seemed to close in on me, and the more I thought about it, the less I understood. What had happened? Why did he suddenly seem so distant? And why did I feel like I was being pulled into something bigger than either of us could control? The next day, it only got worse. I found something I wasn't supposed to see. A note hidden under his pillow, written in a hand I didn't recognize. What it said made my heart race, but at the same time, it made no sense. I couldn't stop thinking about that note. Every time I tried to push the thought aside, it came back stronger. Who had written it? Why had my stepson kept it hidden? The note didn't offer many answers, just vague words that hinted at something more, a secret that I wasn't a part of. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just something harmless, a teenager's private thoughts, nothing to worry about. But deep down, I knew better. The next few days were a blur. I watched him closely, trying to piece together the puzzle, but he was as elusive as ever. His behavior grew even more erratic. Sometimes he'd be withdrawn, barely saying a word. Other times, he'd act strangely nervous, glancing over his shoulder as if someone was watching him. But what unsettled me the most was how he started avoiding me altogether. He would go out for hours without telling anyone where he was going, coming back late with that same distant look on his face. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. What was she talking about? Had she known something I didn't? And if so, why hadn't she told me? The questions piled up, one after another, each one more disturbing than the last. But as I stood there in the kitchen, frozen, one thought stood out above all else. Whatever was happening, it was far from over. It was only just beginning. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, images of my stepson's strange behavior and my wife's cryptic words kept swirling in my mind. Something felt wrong. Something was hidden. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more it gnawed at me. The atmosphere in our house had shifted. There was an undeniable tension hanging in the air that none of us could shake off. I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to know what was going on. The next day, I decided to follow him. It wasn't something I was proud of, but I needed answers. I waited until he left the house in the early afternoon, slipping out the back door without a word. I quietly grabbed my keys and followed him at a distance. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched him move through the neighborhood, looking over his shoulder every so often as if he sensed someone was watching him. He led me to a part of town I didn't recognize, a quiet, almost eerie street with old, abandoned buildings. My stomach churned. I had no idea what I was walking into, but I couldn't turn back now. I watched from a distance as he entered one of the buildings, a rundown place that looked like it hadn't seen any visitors in years. I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing with possibilities. What was he doing there? Who was he meeting? I waited for what felt like an eternity before I decided to approach. I crept closer to the building, trying to make myself as invisible as possible. The door was slightly ajar, and I could hear muffled voices coming from inside. My pulse quickened. Should I go in? What if I found something I wasn't supposed to? My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but my curiosity and fear pushed me forward. I reached for the door, slowly and cautiously. Just as my hand touched the handle, I heard a voice from behind me. My stepson's voice, but this time it wasn't the same calm tone I was used to. It was sharp, urgent. "What are you doing here?" I spun around, my heart racing. There he was, standing just a few feet away, his eyes wide with a mix of anger and fear. For the first time, I saw something truly unsettling in his gaze. It wasn't just the distance between us anymore. It was like he was hiding something dark, something that I wasn't meant to uncover. I stood there, frozen in place, as my stepson stared me down. His face was pale, his lips pressed into a tight line. The fear in his eyes was unmistakable, but it wasn't the kind of fear you'd expect from a child caught doing something wrong. No, this was different. It was as if he was terrified of something far beyond just me finding out. "What are you doing here?" he asked again, his voice barely a whisper, trembling with urgency. "You're not supposed to be here." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to turn around and walk away, pretend I hadn't seen anything, but another part of me knew I couldn't. Not now. Not when the truth seemed so close, yet so far out of reach. "What's going on, Jake?" I asked, my voice steady, though my heart was racing. "What's this place? Why are you sneaking around?" He shook his head. the fear in his eyes turning to something darker, resentment, maybe even anger. "You don't understand. You don't know what you're getting into," he muttered, stepping back slowly as if trying to distance himself from me. I took a step forward, but he held up his hand, stopping me in my tracks. "Stay away." I was on the verge of pressing him for answers when the door behind him creaked open. A man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, his face partially obscured by shadows. My first instinct was to retreat, but I was paralyzed, unable to move. The man didn't say a word. He just stared at me with a cold, calculating look in his eyes. There was something about him that made my skin crawl, like he wasn't someone I wanted to meet, let alone be in the same room with. Jake took a deep breath, as if bracing himself for something, and then turned to face the man. "It's time," he said, his voice cracking slightly. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of the situation, but all I could think about was that voice. "It's time for what?" Before either of them could respond, the man spoke, his voice low and threatening. "You should leave now," he said, addressing me directly. "This isn't something you want to be a part of." I took a step back, my pulse pounding in my ears. What was going on here? What had I stumbled into? And why was Jake involved in this? I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me, suffocating me. There were no answers, only questions that piled on top of one another, growing mo. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me, suffocating me. There were no answers, only questions that piled on top of one another, growing more urgent with every passing second. I opened my mouth to ask more, but before I could, the man took a step toward me. He moved quickly, his hand reaching for my arm with a grip so strong that I almost stumbled backward. "Get out," he repeated, his tone now dangerous, like a warning I couldn't ignore. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Something shifted in that moment, something I couldn't name, but it was as if the air around me had thickened, filled with danger. I could sense the tension rising, the stakes escalating beyond anything I had imagined. Jake's face was now an unreadable mask, his eyes avoiding mine as if he was ashamed, or worse, fearful of what was coming. I could feel the cold sweat on my forehead, but I couldn't look away from him. "Jake," I said, barely able to get the words out. "What is going on? Why are you involved with him?" Jake's expression faltered, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of regret in his eyes. He opened his mouth to say something, but the man cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Enough!" he barked, his gaze flicking from Jake to me. "It's time you leave, now!" I felt my legs weaken as I tried to process everything. My mind raced, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't wrap my head around what I was witnessing. Whatever secret had been lurking in the shadows was now out in the open, and there was no turning back. As I turned to leave, my stomach twisted with fear and confusion. The worst part? I knew that this was only the beginning. The real story was about to unfold, and I had no idea what role I would play in it. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest as I tried to process everything. The man's grip on my arm was tightening, and I knew that I had no choice but to get out of there. I glanced at Jake, hoping for some sign of what was really happening, but all I saw was a look of defeat in his eyes. It was clear now, whatever this was, it was far bigger than anything I had imagined. I pulled my arm free from the man's grasp, my body shaking as I backed away. "Jake, what's going on?" I asked again, my voice barely a whisper. "Tell me the truth, please." For a long moment there was silence. The man stood still, his eyes never leaving me, while Jake seemed to be struggling with his own emotions. Finally Jake spoke, his voice barely audible. "You don't understand," he said. "I didn't want any of this, but I didn't have a choice." My mind was racing. What do you mean you didn't have a choice? What's happening here? Jake's voice trembled as he continued. He's not just anyone, okay? He's my father. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had never suspected anything like that. The man standing in front of me wasn't just some stranger. He was Jake's biological father, the man I had never known about until now. The realization sent a cold chill through me, and I struggled to find the right words to respond. But why? Why didn't you tell me? Why did you keep this from us? Jake lowered his gaze, his face filled with regret. I couldn't. I didn't want you to know. I thought I could handle it on my own, but now it's all out of control. He's been watching me, watching us, for a long time. He's been planning something. I turned to look at the man, my mind spinning. He seemed calm, almost too calm, as if all of this had been a part of some plan from the very beginning. What does he want? I asked, my voice steady despite the fear building inside me. The man stepped forward, his face hardening. It's not just about him, he said, his voice cold. It's about all of us. You're involved now, whether you like it or not. My stomach twisted. There was something off about the entire situation, something I still didn't understand. Before I could ask more, the man suddenly grabbed a small device from his pocket and pressed a button. The air around us seemed to shift as a hidden door in the wall slid open, revealing a set of stairs that led down into the darkness below. My heart skipped a beat. Jake's expression changed, a mixture of fear and reluctance. I told you, it's bigger than you think. I tried to stop it, but now we're too deep. As we stood there, facing the unknown, the door closed behind us, and I realized that whatever had been set in motion was now inevitable. The true nature of this twisted web of secrets had finally begun to reveal itself, and I was caught in the middle of it. But just as I thought I understood the situation, a final chilling voice echoed from the shadows. You really thought you could stop it, didn't you? And with that, the world around me shifted again, and I was plunged deeper into a mystery that would change everything. The voice from the shadows lingered in the air, sending a shiver down my spine.
I turned toward it, my heart racing. The man who had been lurking in the dark now stepped forward, his face cold and calculating. But in that moment, something shifted within me. I wasn't going to back down. I needed to understand what had been happening, not just for my sake, but for Jake's too. I don't know what game you're playing, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But it's over. Whatever this is, it ends now. The man chuckled darkly, as if my words were of no consequence. You think you can stop this? You have no idea what you're dealing with. This has been in motion for years. His words hit me like a hammer. What had I gotten myself into? But before I could process it any further, Jake spoke up, his voice trembling. I didn't know what to do. He's been controlling everything behind the scenes. I thought if I stayed away, it would stop. But it didn't. It only got worse. I looked at Jake, his expression filled with guilt and fear. Jake? I said softly. You don't have to do this. We can figure this out together. The man stepped forward again, but this time something in his stance had changed. He wasn't as sure of himself. A flicker of hesitation crossed his face. You don't understand, he muttered, almost as if speaking to himself. You don't know what he's capable of. That was the moment I realized. The man was afraid of Jake. It wasn't the other way around. Jake wasn't just caught in the middle of this. It was Jake who had the power. The truth began to unravel right before my eyes. Jake turned to me, a fire igniting in his eyes. I won't let him control me anymore. It's time to end this for good. With that, Jake moved toward the door, his hand steady as he activated a hidden mechanism that I hadn't seen before. The man looked as if he was about to stop him, but then he hesitated. The truth was clear. Jake had been the key all along. The power had always been in his hands, and he finally realized it. The door slid open, and with one last glance at the man, Jake and I stepped into the light. As we left the building behind us, I felt the weight of everything lift off my shoulders. The mystery had been solved, the secrets revealed. It wasn't just about family, it was about control, power, and breaking free from what held us back. We walked away from that place, knowing that things would never be the same again. But sometimes, that's how life works. We face the darkness, and we choose to step into the light. The journey was far from easy, but it was ours to navigate. And together, we would face whatever came next, stronger and wiser than before.